Deck plate leadership is a term we use in the Navy, which is about those kind of skills of being present to your team, being present to your people. And so I'm looking at existing literature on how to navigate conversations and difficult challenges. And I'm layering in a few constructs from, of all things, firefighting, naval firefighting, and how the fire triangle of oxygen, fuel, and heat is giving me a framework that could help school leaders, could help classroom teachers, anybody for that matter, to more successfully navigate the challenges of those hot button, front burner, difficult conversations. So I'm just going back to some really powerful literature that's been very well accepted and prominent in terms of here's what's known to be effective. But I'm also, so that's that lens of appreciative inquiry. And then really jumping into that space of how can I bring this new construct forward, grounded in research and best practice, but perhaps frame it in a different way that might resonate more with school leaders in the day-to-day encounters and work that they're doing.
I actually have a number of other podcasts. This is the only one that's actually active at the moment, but I had one called Outside the Classroom where I interviewed teachers, educators who had interesting hobbies outside the classroom that sometimes informed their teaching practices, sometimes they didn't, but I just find that always fascinating. It was interesting. Anyway, today's guest would be a perfect fit for that. And what a fascinating conversation. So my episode today is with Dr. Tim Cusack, who's the Dean of Education at Concordia University in Edmonton. And he has a number of, I think, interests outside the classroom, but he's also very intentional and thoughtful around how those outside interests inform his practice as an educator. One in particular is his lifelong commitment to the Naval Academy. I don't know anybody who has had a lifelong commitment to the Naval Academy. And it's been a big part of who Tim is, and it informs his practice, as you just heard in that opening intro, thinking about all of the analogies and the lessons learned from the teamwork and just even the naval kind of experience. That's interesting. And as you'll hear, the very first story that he shares is a falling into this odd impression of a Canadian broadcaster, Don Cherry. So that's another funny story. Anyway, I got to know Tim a number of years ago when he was in the Edmonton Catholic School District, and just one of those people that you just connect with right away because he's just got so much story and so much passion. But also, we get into some really interesting conversations about leadership and professional learning. Great work he's done on the role of assistant principals. Lots of really interesting things he's trying to do and continues to try to do, both at the university, but also outside of that in his consulting and in the books that he's written. Just a fascinating discussion, so full of entry points for people. And I just know you're going to enjoy today's conversation with Dr. Tim Cusack. All right. There we go. So Tim, you and I paths have crossed over the years, and I don't know, I'm excited about this conversation because there's just a lot that you bring to the table, I think, that I don't really know. And so that's part of my wanting to get you on here, is to hear about all these really interesting facets of education. But I do want to start with the sort of oddball thing. And now, for those people listening, I get it. Don Cherry may not be in the highest regard in Canadian lore as that. So putting that aside, we get it that some people have certain feelings about, and that's fine. However, back in the day, you and Don Cherry have an interesting sort of connection. So just because I remember you telling me a little bit about the sort of the origin story of this. So maybe tell us why you and Don Cherry have a little bit of a link here.
Yeah, I know. That's great. So we're going back to 2006. And of course, that's when the Oilers made their run at a Stanley Cup against Carolina. And it just so happened I was assistant principal at a high school. And we had tuxedo companies and gown companies coming in, and they were presenting the wares and what people could take to wear to prom. And so the assistant principals got to pick something fancy. So I picked something in the style of Don Cherry, like double-breasted blazer, a bright cherry color vest. And lo and behold, the local CBC station had a release your inner Don Cherry contest down at the downtown studio. I went, and they had this cardboard cutout of Ron McLean, and you had 1 minute, not just to look like Don Cherry, but to do your best to sound like Don Cherry. Now, backing it up a little bit further, I was the morning announcement assistant principal at said high school. And I loved giving the announcements and updates. And I'd use a little bit of funny voices or play some characters, that sort of thing. So I had a pretty good Don Cherry impersonation. But when I was on that stage under the lights at downtown CBC, I became Don Cherry for that minute. And it was wild. And it's on YouTube. If you Google Tim Cusack,
Yes.
Don Cherry, the 1 minute clip from Coach's Corner is there. Yes, folks, Coach's Corner. It was the same day as my wedding anniversary, and my wife and I were out for supper. And so I got a call from one of the Western producers for Hockey Night in Canada. And he said, "Hey, Tim, I have to tell you, Grapes was enthralled with your impersonation of him." And he says, "Hey, how would you like to be on the show?" Pinch, there I am, 1 minute on Coach's Corner, reenacting that Don Cherry moment. And I would later run into Don. I'm also an officer in the Naval Reserve. And I was on my way from Edmonton to Vancouver for some weekend training. Lo and behold, Don and Ron come up through the gate. They just got off their plane. They were doing Hockey Night in Canada in Edmonton. And I walk up to Mr. Cherry. I say, "Hey, it's so wonderful to see you." He goes, "I remember you. You're the guy who does me better than me." That was a good compliment. Fun. The students loved it. They got to see one of their teachers, one of their school leaders in a fun light. And what was really interesting is I started getting calls after that to do corporate gigs, to host sports banquets and corporate awards as Don Cherry. I actually got to go to a retiring NHL player's party, and I got to roast him as Don Cherry, as fake Don Cherry. Yeah, it was fun. And again, it's just one of those fun moments that can happen. It's the magic of being in a school in that moment. So everything came together with the tuxedo, going downtown, having a principal that supported it and thought it was pretty fun. And yeah, the rest, as they say, was Hockey Night in Canada history.
Nice. Yeah. No, I love that. Just such a great story and so fun to have that. I get all those pieces come together. Now, in that little share, you just tossed in this idea of that you're part of the Naval Academy. And I know I believe you're an East Coast boy. That's where a lot of this began. So I'm not sure if that's the sort of where that part of it, but talk about your involvement with the Naval Academy all these years. And even just as you share that experience, how that perhaps has even played into your role as a school leader.
Yeah, great question. So yes, originally from St. John, New Brunswick, and it was the summer of grade 11. I joined the Summer Youth Employment Program at HMCS Brunswicker, which is one of 24 Naval Reserve divisions across Canada. And so our role is to force generate, support the regular force, a lot of training, be the face of the Navy for Canada. And it just started off as that sort of part-time job in the early years, and I really enjoyed it. I got to go to sea. I got to become trained in first aid, in weapons handling and safety, the leadership skills that I learned, navigation skills. So I eventually became an officer, which is called a Naval Warfare Officer. And Dean, I've been at this for 40 years now. And for me, I'm in my second tour of command as the commanding officer of HMCS Nonsuch, which is Edmonton's Naval Reserve Division. And so with 24 units across the country, you can well imagine that I bonded with a lot of people in my early years. And I can recall in my early 20s being an officer of the watch. So being on the bridge of a ship, being off the coast of Cape Breton in heavy seas, and really learning the value and the power of the team around you, that you really had to rely on everybody. It's a ship with a small ship's company. There's a fire, there's a flood, there's an emergency. Everybody has a role to play, and everybody has to have those competencies and skills to fulfill that. And for me, the parallel to education has been beautiful. When we look at leadership, just doesn't happen in offices. Leadership happens on the deck plates. So in the hallways of our schools, in the classrooms where the learning takes place. So from a very young age, I think more than anything, what being a member of the Royal Canadian Navy has instilled in me was regardless of the title, how many bars are on your shoulder or how many chevrons are on your sleeve or what your title is or letters before or after your name, it's really the dynamic of working with people. And I learned that respect is earned. It's never demanded. And I think that has really helped me in all of my various leadership roles. And I'll say, particularly as a classroom teacher, I espoused the leadership training I received in the military in my leading a learning community and instructional leadership in the classroom, which ironically, those skills aren't even noted in Alberta's teacher quality standard. And so when we think of teachers as leaders, I think as a young person, that really helped me to see leadership in the face of my team, in the skills of my people, in their welfare and their well-being, and really pull it together as a team. So aspects of distributive leadership, shared leadership, and those human dynamics of equity and fairness, and above all, trust and respect. It's a huge part of who I am. And this is why I'm still here 40 years hence. Fun fact, when I joined, it was 40 years after the end of World War II. And for me, World War II seemed like it was 100 years ago kind of thing. And so this past June of 2025, I realized that I had been in the Navy 40 years, which was when I joined, 40 years away from World War II. Now I'm 40 years away from when I joined. I'm old.
And it probably doesn't seem like it's that long ago, though. And that's the reality, is that when you joined it 40 years ago wasn't that long ago, but as a teenager, it seemed just a whole other deal. Yeah.
But and I highly recommend it to folks if you're interested in that sort of service and that sort of skill acquisition and opportunities, whether it's the cadet movement for kids or the reserves or even the regular force. Like, there's so many opportunities, and I'm thankful for those opportunities.
And I know that for some people, they just can't fathom the military because its reputation of being very disciplined and very approached. However, I wonder, and I think, Tim, in today's world, we've got a lot of young men in particular who are struggling with finding purpose, finding what do I do? And both you and I, when we grew up, the choices were far fewer. And so you didn't, whatever, like you're going to pick this or that. And a lot of it was based on geography. A lot of it was based on, but now I think not only are there challenges in the world that maybe we didn't face, but I think also just the sheer volume of what possibly should I do? Like the choices are endless, which is often very paralyzing for people. So think about, the opportunity that a young woman too. I don't want to make this all about males, but I'm just thinking about that. There's a bit of a crisis there. How a short career in the military could be really helpful for a lot of folks.
And as I said, there are a variety of different trades and different opportunities. And what I really appreciate about the reserve is you get to kick the tires a little bit. You get to try it out. We have a Naval Experience program where you can basically be a sailor for a year, and we give you exposure to all the various different trades, occupations that exist within the Navy. And then you get to really get a sense of what does it mean to be a sailor? What does it mean to be on a ship? What does it mean to be at sea? And again, kick the tires. If you like it, here you go. And that world opens up. When I think of some dear friends, even my own brother, who served as a reservist for 25 years and then joined the permanent force, the regular Navy. So even my own kids, I said they were in Army cadets, and they had an opportunity to travel and learn leadership skills and first aid. And it was great. They were gone for 3 to 6 weeks every summer, and a liter of milk and a bag of chips lasted more than 2 minutes kind of thing. You stop cooking with cheese. It's for real. Now, these opportunities for them to gain valuable experiences. And my middle son, Nick, he got to go to Europe twice as a teenager with cadets. Now, the fun thing is, my eldest son, he has joined the permanent force. He's full-time with the Navy. I didn't expect that. I didn't push for that. He found his way. My middle son is in his 4th year of teaching. He's in junior high now, and my youngest son is in his 1st year of teaching. And they're both reserve officers. So for me, I think the example we can set as a parent is powerful. But again, to your point, there are a lot of opportunities. We just need people to take a look, come and try. And I hearken back to something one of our admirals said in terms of the mission and scope of being in the Navy or being in the Canadian Armed Forces. And it's this: people first, mission always. And that has resonated with me in every leadership role I've been in. And I would say the parallel for education would be people first, learning always. Learning is and so
Right.
for me, yeah, if you're wondering what's there or how you can engage with it, there's a lot of opportunities, and check it out. The Canadian Armed Forces is looking for people, and there are opportunities that await people who are looking for that adventure and have a leadership opportunity and to gain some really meaningful skills that you can bring into your civilian walk of life as well.
So I realize we're about 14 minutes into this conversation. And for people who don't know, you might think, you had this guy on, he does Don Cherry impressions and he's part of the Navy. What does the heck does this have to do with education? So let's maybe provide a little context for people to find out where you are right now. So again, we'll dive into maybe some of the specifics, but talk about your current. And again, we've got the naval side of it. That's still an active part of your world, but you have a different role right now, a full-time role, as well as some other sort of things that are tangential to the work. And then go back a little bit about how you got to where you are now.
Yeah, sure. So currently I'm serving as the Dean of Education at Concordia University of Edmonton. So I'm in my third year in this role, and I absolutely love that I am working with early career teachers. We have a 2-year Bachelor of Education after degree program. And for me, it's so important that we help these early career teachers to not just survive, but to thrive. We really want them to flourish. We know that retention is one of the biggest challenges we're facing right now in education. And what I love about the role is the opportunity to engage in meaningful research. And one of the things that's very important to me is to get the voices of our recent grads. And so I've looked out 3 to 5 years to say, hey, what did we do well in helping you feel confident and capable in your role as a classroom teacher? But more than that, what else would you to have had a little bit more of? Or is there something that maybe we just touched on, but there's more value in going deeper? So, Dean, the power of getting that feedback from recent grads and then feeding that forward into how we're adjusting the program, we're hearing the need to provide teachers or better equip them with more classroom management skills, to look at differentiation of instruction. We're hearing about the various gaps in reading ability, the learning challenges that are manifest in the classroom now more than ever. We have unlimited needs and wants, the learning needs of our students, but very limited resources. So how do we navigate that space? And again, that's where my Navy navigator hat comes on. And we're looking for those solutions and those opportunities. But I'm a huge proponent of teaching people how to fish. So the more upstream we can go in the skills, the competencies, the fluencies, the professional aspects and attributes of being a successful teacher today is powerful. The other piece of research I'm really passionate about as well is helping our existing veteran teachers. And sometimes we're thinking people who have that permanent certification, that 3 to 5 years as our veterans now, because of the amount of folks who are perhaps exiting the profession. So we're looking at leaning on our existing cadre of teachers to step into the mentorship ring, to seek to understand how to be a more intentional and more effective mentor to an early career teacher. And by early career, I'm also acknowledging those folks who are coming from a second or third career into the education space. The face of education students today isn't that person necessarily who's just finished their first undergraduate degree in their early 20s. We're seeing folks in their 30s, 40s, 50s coming into the education training milieu and wanting to be in the classroom and have that opportunity to lead the learning in their own classroom space. For me, Dean of Education is it was a natural extension of my previous role. We'll back up to that. I retired in 2023 as a deputy superintendent of a large urban school board. So 50,000 students, about 5,000 staff, 50,000 students, 100 schools. And it was the hallmark of my time in leadership at a systems level. And that earlier iteration was assistant superintendent of learning services and innovation. That's where we first crossed paths with the ed tech side of things, which is so important. So I was in that role for 5 years, working at the elbow with teachers, looking at curriculum, looking at assessment, looking for ways to really unpack and understand learning outcomes and how to instill greater levels of success in student learning and teacher efficacy. Prior to that, I was a principal at 3 different schools, and I served as a principal K through 12. And I then classroom teacher, which that's probably, in all honesty, where I felt the most impactful, where I had the most influence on student success was as a classroom teacher. So I am always a teacher first, and I really never lost sight of the importance of what our teachers do day in, day out, and to champion that voice and to care for that voice. And when we think of public trust in education, it is that the teachers we are preparing can really lean into that space of working with children. Schools sit at the intersection of communities' values, children's futures. And that's why I firmly believe that educational leadership is, as I said with the Navy, it's as much about trust as it is about instruction. Sadly, some of that trust has been fractured, and we have to push through that, and we have to be resilient, and we have to understand that ultimately decisions that we're making, whether it's in our classroom, in our school proper, that our principals and assistant principals are working on, that superintendents make at a jurisdictional level, we have to look through that porthole of seeing students first. And if every decision we make sees the students in the classroom and how we're leaning in and layering that support to them, then I think those are good decisions. But we have this concept in the Navy called mission creep. And sometimes that one great initiative you're working on becomes 5 great initiatives, becomes 17 miscellaneous initiatives. We're suffering from initiative-itis and we're overwhelmed. There's too much on our plate. So how do we deconflict? How do we hone in on really what's impactful and what's meaningful? And I think this is really where we have to recapture. I talk a lot about reclaiming the narrative of what it means to be a teacher today, of reframing the mission of what it means to be a teacher today. And I think that reclamation and that reframing of what great teaching and learning looks like in Alberta or in any part of the world for that matter, that points towards retention. We want people to come into this profession and see it as a vocation and that they have a meaningful opportunity to impact lives. When people often ask me in the various leadership roles I've been in, what is school leadership like? And really, I use the metaphor of vessel traffic management or air traffic control. Lots of moving parts. Everyone is heading somewhere important. And we're trying to keep things running as smoothly and safely, calmly, and responsibly as possible. But there's a lot of extraneous, and again, in the political realm, in the societal realm, in the cultural realm, that is impacting the good work we're trying to do with teaching and learning. So we have to navigate through the noise, the white noise, all of this, and really find those ways to lean into what really matters most.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. So many things that you talked about just resonate very deeply with me. First of all, the whole focus on young teachers and getting them off to a place where they can thrive in their career and not just survive. And we hear that a lot with, especially as veteran teachers come to the end of their career, there's this sense of, I just got to get to the end, right? Which is understandable, but at the same time, I don't know, that's how we want people to think of their role. So how do we get them in a position early on to thrive? And then this last piece you shared, I think, I love this analogy of the air traffic controller and just reducing the noise. There's so much. You shouldn't have to worry about this and this. Like you see the task right in front of you. There's kids right there that come every day that need you. How do I, as a leader, remove the distractions, remove sort of the things that, and not just remove them, but then also provide you the supports that you need when it comes to the fact that you do have children in your room who are requiring supports and resources that you might not as an individual have. And I think we've always, I think, struggled with how to break down the isolating experience of teachers, much of whom choose the profession, some of them, I would say, because they want to be isolated. They want to have that autonomy. We want to honor that. Yeah, that's great. You're in a classroom. You have so much autonomy, but we don't want that to be done in such a way where you feel isolated. There's a difference between autonomy and isolation. And that's a very thin line sometimes. And that's where school leaders play such a key role in ensuring there's that right balance of giving you autonomy, but not making you feel isolated as part of it. Or yeah, I want to just, again, maybe talk a little bit about a couple things. One, I want to hear a little bit about some of the writing you've been doing, some of the books you've been writing specifically, which I think is maybe part of that. But first, as part of this show, I'm trying to give people a sense of education across Canada and how it looks different. And so you're currently in Alberta. You spent the last good part of your career in Alberta, but you have experience in other provinces. And I'm always curious to hear people's perception of how things are. And again, probably 90% of things aren't a million miles different. Kids are kids, where they're in New Brunswick or they're in Edmonton or wherever. But it's always interesting to explore some of the nuance differences that you've noticed, whether it's culturally or just even in terms of systemic kind of things that are in place that you call out as being different. So maybe just talk a little bit about that Canadian-wide experience.
In my earlier career, of course, I did my after degree at Mount Allison University in Sackville, New Brunswick. And my first official teaching job was at Tantramar Regional High School, where I finished my after degree and I got to work on a short-term contract there. And of course, being from New Brunswick and being back frequently, talk a lot with my brother who works in the Ministry of Education. And I guess the more succinct way to say is, when we look at governance is done somewhat similar, but markedly differently in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia compared to Alberta. So whereas we have locally elected boards that govern school divisions, we have a strong tradition of local autonomy and community governance. Alberta has one of the more diverse systems when we think of public, Catholic, Francophone, charter, independent schools. Whereas in the Maritimes, it's more kind of one system, or New Brunswick with the Francophone boards and the Anglophone boards. And so instead of a school board per se, there's a district educational council, the DECs, but they have more limited authority or scope compared to Alberta school boards. So in New Brunswick, for example, superintendents report directly to the Provincial Department of Education, whereas in Alberta, the superintendent is hired by the board, elected local officials. And in Nova Scotia, similarly, they have regional centers for education, and they also have the Conseil scolaire acadien provincial. And so governance authority is concentrated more so at the government level in the Maritimes, vice decentralized with school boards and the strength of school boards. I think ultimately what changes is the policy framework is markedly different, but what's consistent is clearly the importance of relationships, of stakeholder engagement, of stakeholder voice. What I've really appreciated, New Brunswick has established these centers of excellence and looking at the career technology, those foundational skills, partnering with a lot of industries. So whether that's McCain, New Brunswick Power, looking at opportunities to give students that hands-on practical application, a deeper dive into trades preparation as well, versus just post-secondary pathways. And I think that's an important conversation as well. You mentioned earlier pathways for young people to consider today. And I think we need to bracket some of the bias of, and I'll say even in my own role, like where I want people to come to university and become a teacher, but also to acknowledge that's not everybody's pathway. And so I think the more intentionality we can bring into high schools and going upstream again and showing high school and even junior high students the myriad pathways that exist.
Right.
I think we can be more intentional with that in Alberta. And I think that's a great lesson to take away from what New Brunswick is doing, for example. And my brother Mike tells me a lot about this initiative, and he's been part of that work. And So for me, it's powerful because whether it's every school, every classroom, every teacher, every leader really wants nothing more than the success of the students that they're entrusted with. And
Yeah.
I think as a society, the more that we can shine light on that work integrated pathways, on micro credentialing, dual credit opportunities. And I was a huge fan of that when I was a deputy superintendent with Edmonton Catholic Schools, looking at partnerships, not just with the local universities, but with the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology, other partners as well, to do just that, shine light on the pathways that people can look at. When I was in high school, I really didn't have the measure of guidance counseling that I probably needed. It's not that there wasn't any. It's just, it was one of those late in grade 12 type of, what do you want to do with your life now? So I'm glad I joined the Navy because that could be a lot of direction and
Right.
guidance. And if I hadn't had that, it might have been a very different outlook. But I just think there's a lot of lessons we learn from other provinces, and there's no Canadian national standard or national framework. I've often thought about that. Could
Yeah.
there be? Might there be? What would that look like? But that said, it's a provincial and territorial responsibility. So we have 13 different but similar systems. And I've often wondered how we might be more intentional in how that reciprocity of learning from and with our colleagues in the other provinces and territories. And I think we're starting to see more of that collaboration, but I
Yeah.
think we have a ways to go yet.
Yeah. And I guess what I think, what I so appreciate your share there is that there, and this is my experience, I have the privilege of working in all the provinces, so I see a degree of how they're different. But I think you teasing out from New Brunswick this one element of a focus on trades, and how might that be then adopted? And Alberta has lots of strengths as well that other
Or
provinces should look at and say, oh, they do this thing pretty well. And that's what I think, that's what my hope is in the conversations we have, is that we find not to copy, because again, there's cultural, there's geographical, there's literally like just physical differences in demographics and all that stuff, right? That is what it is there and has to be done in a certain way. But when we find these little bits of, oh, there's something here that I think we want to find out. And again, they've gone down this path farther than others. And so just that's what I hope that we do. So I appreciate you calling that out specifically.
yeah, no,
Um,
maybe if I might,
yeah.
I'm going to say a parallel example is when I do the orientation for our first year teacher candidates in our BEd program, I talk to them about having an adventure. So I moved from New Brunswick when there weren't a lot of teaching jobs, and I came to Northern Alberta. So I was up in McLennan, Alberta, sort of Peace Country area, and stayed there for 5 years. And then I taught in Brooks, Alberta for 4 years. And then I came back to Edmonton. And so I think, when we look at the need that we have in our rural, particularly our northern school boards, where they're having an incredibly difficult time attracting teachers and getting teachers to come that they so desperately need. And so I think giving that opportunity of, you might want to teach in your own backyard. I didn't. I chose to move 4,000 kilometers away. I thought I'd try Alberta for 3 or 4 years. 35 years later, here I am still
Trying it out.
and I think we need to perhaps be more intentional in providing that guidance or showcasing the opportunities that teaching can be a grand adventure. And I have more folks from international agencies and other provinces knocking on my door saying, hey, can we talk to your teachers? Can we let them know about opportunities that exist, not just here in Alberta or
Right.
Canada, but elsewhere? When we think of the projected global teacher shortage of 20 million teachers we're going to need by 2030, we have to start somewhere and be open to the fact that we can send them out into the world, hopefully well equipped to find that success, to stay.
Yeah, for sure. You talked about these different roles you've had, and I'm always curious, again, for somebody who's had such varied roles in their career, is there one that was like, oh, that was a big jump? So maybe it was teacher to principal, I mean, or maybe it was principal to district. I don't know which one of those was, but when you look back at all these little steps and you took a job, and was there one where you took it and you go, oh, this is more than I had really thought it was, or there's a lot of pieces here that I just didn't understand, and you would point to as that was a lot of learning curve that went in with that particular transition?
Yeah, no, I look at the various roles and can argue that there was a delta of change in all of them. But I will say for me, I think because it really inspired my doctoral studies was the change in professional identity from classroom teacher into the role of assistant principal. And I still believe that the role of assistant principal is more of that unsung hero. They are largely attuned to the instructional leadership. They're still teaching, in most respects, a measure of their day, where you can feel like you're in control of something. Whereas in the leadership duties and tasks and assignment, it's a little more nebulous. And I think as an assistant principal, you're given a portfolio, and depending on who your principal is, you may be encouraged, you may have some great mentorship, or you might be compartmentalized, that you are the scheduler and that's it. Or you are in charge of supervision, you're in charge of bus scheduling, you're in charge of the discipline. And it can become a very isolated or lonely experience because you don't get to make a lot of the bigger decisions. You are hopefully contributing and collaborating to some of the vision and mission value setting within the school. But essentially, you have a lot of responsibility. Your former peers, and for me, I was promoted within my own school. So I went from having been classroom teacher, department head, to the assistant principal, one of three assistant principals in that building. And it was people expect you to be different, or some of the teachers started treating me differently. And I'm like, hey, I'm still me. I'm still Tim. And it was hurtful sometimes or confusing because it's, oh, you crossed over to this pathway and you kind of left us behind, or now you think you're our boss and you're in charge of us, and all of these sort of dynamics and tensions. And we have to navigate those tensions responsibly. And I think this is coming back to why being in the Navy and having that leadership training was so helpful for me. Back to earning trust and earning respect.
Right.
And I had to remind people that just because my title was assistant principal, it's still me. It's still that person who cares very much about students first and learning. And I think in time, most people saw that I was genuine and that I really wanted to champion teachers. And I think now in my current role, so after I retired as deputy chief superintendent, I'm really the superintendent who came back to school. I came back to university because I'm so passionate about equipping teachers to be successful and to flourish. So yeah, I think the assistant principal space is one that needs more attention. And I said that became the focus of my doctoral study. I wanted
Mm.
to understand the sense of self-efficacy that assistant principals had and have, the tensions that they felt in the role. And I asked them in my study, I surveyed about 150 current assistant principals, and I asked them if they held intentions to become a principal. And that was just a really great open-ended question to have, because when I unpacked my data, it inspired my first book, which was called Leader Ready: Four Pathways to Prepare Aspiring School Leaders. And I was so blessed to have Professor John Hattie write the afterword for me, and talking about our learning standards, talking about our teacher standards, talking about our leader quality standards. And as a superintendent whose portfolio was principalship, mentoring, and leadership support, I felt I needed to go deeper in my own learning and my own understanding, and not simply take for granted that I was an assistant principal. So let me tell you everything about it. It was a 50-year deep literature review. And what was so interesting is at the end of the 1970s, at the end of the 80s, at the end of the 90s, at the end of the early 2000s, and the 2010s, the message was the same. Assistant principals play a critically important role in the leadership dynamic and life of a school. We should do more for them to better prepare them. But what I was finding, there wasn't a whole lot being done. It was
Yeah.
more platitudinal or talking about what should be done, or maybe how it might be done. And so for me, it was important to ask assistant principals, what do you think you need? What's important to you? Let's talk about the opportunities you're getting or not getting. And the mantra was, so goes the principal, so goes the quality and level of mentorship of assistant principals, AKA aspiring principals or school leaders. And so I thought, as a central leadership member, as a deputy superintendent, we had to create a more harmonized and common approach to make sure that all of these aspiring leaders were getting a baseline of experiential learning and building their skills towards the competencies that they would need to take over the reins of a school, to sit in the chair of principal. And I'll say, and I've learned this in the military, you don't always consolidate your learning and knowledge until you're sitting in the chair, until you're in the role. And there's still a lot of learning that has to happen. But how could we do a more intentional and better job of raising the quality of PD and raising the skill level of all of our assistant principals to feel like they might be more ready or capable or confident to want to step into principalship? At the outset of my study, 20% said, you can't pay me enough. I've looked at what my principal does. I've seen there's no work-life balance. It's just demand after demand, problems, challenges, dealing with all of these stakeholders. Why would I ever want that? Whereas 35% of them were like, I can't wait to have this opportunity. I feel like I have the skills. I've been supported. I've had somebody who championed me. I've had somebody who made their practice visible to me. And just think of the vulnerability it takes to make your own practice visible to others and open yourself up. So that's what I did. And so, of course, we were butting up to the COVID era where I had to place people with very limited leadership experience as acting principals or acting assistant principals. And the light bulb came on that what they're telling me about what they need really needs to be heeded. There was credence behind that because they were getting what somebody else thought was important. And one person came up to me and used the analogy of, hey, as an assistant principal, we feel like we're sitting at the little kids' table. The principals are getting all of this type of PD and leadership opportunities. We're getting the crumbs off of the table. And so one of the first things I did, predicated in what I heard in my study, was to level the playing field, was to give assistant principals, that steak to chew on versus that piece of bologna they were getting in terms of something to check a list that you're learning, good for you, to really take that word principal, so assistant principal, right? And how do we really bring that skill set alive? And so that gave rise to the Leader Ready text. And, it's been super helpful. We're leveraging it in different American states, most recently in Alaska and North Dakota. And that gave rise to our next two titles. One is Navigating the First Years. It's a toolkit for beginning teachers. That is predicated in the voices from recent graduates at Concordia, what they felt would be helpful or needed, as I mentioned earlier. And then the other book is the Mentor's Guidebook. It is how to help our tenured teachers feel more empowered, more capable, and to be more intentional in the not just onboarding, not just induction, but in truly mentoring early career teachers. And so the Teacher's Toolkit and the Mentor Book are really a companion piece. And we are really enjoying working right now in the state of North Dakota with the North Dakota Rise initiative. It is a state-sponsored and funded intentional teacher mentorship program where new teachers are paired with a veteran teacher. And it is very rigorous in terms of the accountability and the deliverables, but it is valuable in terms of the work we're providing is, who am I as a mentor? How do I become a more effective mentor? How do I really see this human being in front of me that has aspirations to be a teacher? How do I move them beyond that survival mode into that thriving opportunity, that thriving phase? So for me, it's the culmination of my military experience, my K-12 experience, my post-secondary experience. Think of that shamrock Venn diagram type of a thing. But at the center always remains students in classrooms. What more can we do to better equip teachers to be more successful with these kids? And I think I have never lost sight of that. And I think, I hope I never do, because again, people first, mission always, teachers first, learning always in terms of equipping them, because we know they have the biggest impact on the teaching and learning that's happening in our schools. And as administrators, we have a role to play, but again, not administrators as business leaders or building leaders. We can't lose sight of the instructional aspect. And that's why I'll say, when I was an assistant principal, when I was a principal, associate superintendent, I never lost sight that I was first and foremost a teacher.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I hope those ideas resonate in other places, because I think that whole mentorship and supporting our young teachers and assistant principals that's where to invest.
Yeah.
I got one more question for you, and then we'll
Sure.
get into some quick ones to end here. You got to name one person in education that you're grateful for.
I'm going to say Professor John Hattie, and his work has inspired me over the years, the visible learning work. When he tapped me on the shoulder to see how I might be able to bring visible learning into post-secondary spaces, and I think it's important work. Great teaching and learning isn't just in K-12, it is also in our universities, in our colleges. And how do we really press into those spaces where we can help equip professors, sessional instructors, to really understand more of those higher impact teaching and learning strategies, giving more agency to students, giving more voice and choice in the educational decisions and pathways for students. And John was also instrumental in helping us understand aspects of mentorship and in looking at our leadership standards. The work in Australia, for example, is looking at a earlier iteration of standard leadership standards for early career principals, a midlife type of sequence of skills, and a later career expectation. So they're like a differentiated set of leader quality standards. Whereas here in Alberta, we have one set of leadership standards from the novice assistant principal to the 20-year veteran principal. How are we differentiating that? How are we moderating our expectations of what does leading a learning community look like for a first-year assistant principal versus a 15-year veteran principal? And so I think there's some measure of value in those international collaborations. And I think, if anything, John embodies that spirit of opening up our own practice, sharing our research, and even pushing back. And there's been times where he's challenged some of our assumptions. And I think that's a power of mentorship, is to gently push back, or have somebody say, maybe there's a different way, or maybe what you're thinking can be broadened. Here's something else to read. Here's another study to consider. Here's another podcast to listen to really round out perspectives. I would say professionally, as a teacher, as a school leader, as a superintendent, and now my role as Dean of Education, over the many years I've known John and listened to him talk and speak and read his work, he has challenged me, and he's challenged me individually, personally, to move outcomes forward and to not settle for status quo. And I'm thankful for that.
That's awesome. I think anytime you have somebody in your life that makes you question, makes you think, and not just accepts you. Again, we need those people too. They're very encouraging, but we also need those people who are willing to push a little bit. All right, 3 quick questions and we get you out of here. I know you're doing a lot of writing, but what are you reading today?
I'm reading Crucial Conversations. I've gone back to the 3rd edition. And that's really, when I think of some of the discourse and I guess the etiquette in speaking, we're in such a polarized world today in terms of civility and how to have difficult conversations. I'm working on another title, which is focused on deck plate leadership. Deck plate leadership is a term we use in the Navy, which is about those kind of skills of being present to your team, being present to your people. And so I'm looking at existing literature on how to navigate conversations and difficult challenges. And I'm layering in a few constructs from, of all things, firefighting, naval firefighting, and how the fire triangle of oxygen, fuel, and heat is giving me a framework that could help school leaders, could help classroom teachers, anybody for that matter, to more successfully navigate the challenges of those hot button, front burner, difficult conversations. So I'm just going back to some really powerful literature that's been very well accepted and prominent in terms of here's what's known to be effective, but I'm also, so that's that lens of appreciative inquiry. And then really jumping into that space of how can I bring this new construct forward, grounded in research and best practice, but perhaps frame it in a different way that might resonate more with school leaders in the day-to-day encounters and work that they're doing. So
That's a good one. So I don't know how, between your role as a dean, your Naval Academy work, your writing, and all the other stuff, whether you have time to just sit back and just watch something mindless or just experience, like maybe you and your wife have. So I'm always there. You got a binge show or something out there that's just for fun. I like watching this.
I grew up in the 80s, high school. So I just wrapped up the final season of Stranger Things. Loved it. I just really felt they brought it together really incredibly well in resolving the various storylines. But what really resonated with me is the talent of that cast in terms of musicianship. I'm also a bass player. I'm still in a band called Mass Confusion with 3 or 4 retired colleagues, and we play on occasion. It's all about the bass, no trouble. But it's opened my ears to some of this indie music that's out right now. And I'm more of a contemporary, like I love my Rush and Tragically Hip and that Canadian rock and roll scene, but I'm really enjoying this fresher, independent vibe from like Joe Keery, from a lot of the other cast members from Stranger Things who have their own bands, like the Aubreys. It's really neat to listen to, and it's punchy bass lines, and it's just good music to have on in the background when you're editing a chapter or contemplating that next assignment you have to have ready for Dean's Council.
Very good. Very good. Good call. And the last question I want to ask you, I always ask people to give me some hidden gem from where you live. So someplace in the Edmonton area that a person might want to check out. Maybe not as obvious as some of the first things, but like could be a restaurant, a park, a museum, just some place you say, hey, people should check out this place. They might not get it on their first Google search or whatever.
So I'm going to say the Edmonton Riverboat experience. It formerly the Edmonton Queen, but the Edmonton Riverboat, like Edmonton has this beautiful river valley. So for walking, biking, lots of golf courses along it, beautiful in the fall. This big stretch, 30+ kilometer stretch. But to see the city of Edmonton from the vantage point of the North Saskatchewan River, and it's typically a sunset cruise. So there's a big, lovely buffet, but you're on this old kind of stern wheeler and you travel under the various bridges and you get to see the sunset. And then you turn around and you're heading back, and then the lights start coming on and the buildings, and you just get a unique perspective of the city. And I think there's a rustic charm, there's a gentleness of just flowing along the river. I think it reminds us maybe of earlier, simpler times. For me, it just grounded me in the rich history of our forebears, you know, the people who first are Indigenous peoples who have lived here since time memoriam, to the first settlers who came here, and the history. And there's a beautiful connection to my naval unit, HMCS Nonsuch, and the Hudson's Bay Company and the fur trade and Fort Edmonton, all along the river valley. So for me, it's just seeing how it all comes together and how fortunate we are to live where we live, to be in Canada, given everything that's happening in the world, but to take time to appreciate nature and just appreciate go with the flow along the North Saskatchewan. So yeah, check it out. The Edmonton Riverboat. Great experience.
Yeah, I definitely would, because I always say every time I've gone, one of my little travel, I don't know if it's a hack or whatever, but if I ever have 3 or 4 hours or a little bit of time before my plane leaves, I've done my work, I'm off, I often go for a walk somewhere in that little river valley. And there are times where I've taken photos of that place and people say, is that in the mountains? Like, where is this? They don't even realize, no, this is actually in Edmonton.
Yeah.
They go, what? Because it is a pretty spectacular run there. So good call out. And I like the idea of a river cruise. All that kind of stuff is good. So listen, Tim, I appreciate your time today. This has been fantastic, getting to know a little bit more about your journey. And you just shared so many wonderful things. I think people will be really interested in this conversation, and lots of things that they'll want to follow up with you as well. So thanks so much for your time today, Tim.
Yeah, thank you, Dean. It's been a pleasure, and thanks for your leadership and all you're doing to really explore the opportunities and challenges in education today.